there, Scott?
Yes, and I must say the audio that we're getting from the camera is pretty good.
Oh, good. That's a nice surprise.
Yeah, we can use that for audio, and as long as you feel comfortable using what do you call it?
Speaker.
Speakerphone.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's working okay. So, I mean, if you feel like this is good, I'm happy.
We'll just put in subtitles.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is probably not a bad idea anyway.
It probably isn't.
Tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready whenever you are.
The following is a service of ATG Trust. Tax Law Channel host Rob Wood joins us to discuss his recent article in Forbes, 10 Facts About Tax Expatriation. As recently as the 1960s, you could conceivably leave the U.S. permanently and avoid paying some taxes. Over the last 20 years or so, Congress has made that option increasingly more difficult. Rob, welcome back.
Thanks, Scott. Nice to be here.
Hey, wealthy Americans have been trying this for years with some success, although the last 20 years, as I said in the intro, it's becoming increasingly more difficult. Can you talk about the article and what the restrictions are now?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd have to say this is one of those questions that gets asked a lot, but I think relatively few people act on it. It becomes tempting, I suppose, after some big event in Congress, a tax increase or some other legislation that makes you think you want to move to a desert island. I think everybody has those kinds of feelings at one point or another in their life, but relatively few people do it, and relatively few people, probably even fewer, do it for tax reasons. But the basic rules are up until, and this is kind of a bright line date that I discuss in the article, up until June 17 of 2008. June 17 of 2008, there were lots of, it was basically a 10-year rule, so that if you left the U.S. and you were a long-term resident or a U.S. citizen, if you left the U.S., that you would still be subject to U.S. tax for 10 years. There were ways to get out of that. One of the principal ones was if you could show that your leaving the country wasn't tax motivated, but just suffice it to say that it's sort of a 10-year recognition period. It wasn't a bright line where you could just leave the country. The rules got a lot tougher starting for after that date, essentially after June 16 of 2008. If you expatriate then, tax motivation isn't important anymore. That's significant. And essentially, even more punitive, if you will, than a 10-year recognition period is, in general, the current rule is you are treated as selling all of your assets for their fair market value the day you leave the country, and people are calling it an exit tax. So the current rule is that.
Well, I guess in many cases, the government can tax income worldwide, whether or not you're in the U.S. Or not. As long as you've been a citizen, it becomes really difficult.
Yeah, no, and that's true. Actually, you're right to remind me of that. That's a good place to start, which is sort of, for any of this to make any sense, you have to start from the premise that as a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, and that's generally somebody who has a green card. So as a U.S. citizen or permanent resident in the U.S., you are, even if you're not a citizen, as a permanent resident, you're subject to tax on your worldwide income. That's very different from a lot of countries. I mean, our system is such that it doesn't matter whether you have income in foreign countries. There's no restriction under U.S. law, although, of course, recently in the last year or so, there's been a lot of hubbub over Swiss bank accounts. It's perfectly legitimate to have those. It's just that you have to declare them in the U.S. And report them, and you have to pay tax on that income. So you start with that premise. I would just say the major group of people that I see these rules really tripping up would be people that have been, not U.S. citizens, but people who've been living in the U.S., as I say, with a green card for a long time, and they may be particularly surprised by this new set of rules.
Yeah, that seems particularly confusing and, as you said, punitive. As if someone has established residency in the U.S. with a green card, for them to leave, maybe to go back to their home country, they then are still subject to U.S. tax law.
Yeah, no, that's right, and I would just say that there is one, if one thing, if you read this Forbes article, that will become clear, although I try to make it as simple as I can. The rules are very complicated, and I mean, even for tax law, they're very complicated. So there are certain things one can do. One of them, for example, is a way of posting a bond or other security to, even if you are subject to this new exit tax, you can, provided that the IRS feels secure that it's going to get its money later, you can, avoid this deemed sale. The idea being that you're giving them security that they will get their tax when and if you ever sell your property. So there are some things you can do, and there are a few little exceptions, but they're darned small and far between.
It seems like deciding to expatriate really doesn't have any big tax benefits, and you really, I mean, you're giving up U.S. citizenship, and you really do have to leave, but you're not. It doesn't sound like you're getting much of a benefit, if any, tax-wise.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I guess to take the other perspective, if you really wanted to leave for perhaps other reasons, and didn't mind giving up U.S. citizenship and had citizenship in another country, for example, or could easily acquire it, I suppose it would be if you are worth $10 million today and you think that 5 years from now you're going to be worth $100 million, then that appreciation wouldn't be subject to tax in the U.S. But I mean, you're quite right. It's a big step. Relatively few people even think about it. I guess my favorite example of somebody who really played very clever cards, and I should stress this was in the 1990s. It was before these current rules even took place. In fact, even before the 10-year rule took place, as I recall, and that was a fellow who one of the Dart family, a very wealthy family, who left the U.S., expatriated, and was able to come back as a non-U.S. citizen ambassador from the country of Belize, which is where he had moved to, which is sort of a tax haven. And he came back to live in the U.S. in the U.S. Embassy, which had just been opened for him in his previous hometown in Florida, where he had lived as a U.S. citizen. And if that doesn't sound like a very clever tax scam, my name isn't Rob Wood.
Well, regardless of the issue, it's a good idea to get professional help to navigate complicated waters such as these. Rob, it's always a pleasure talking with us, and you just keep writing there.
I'll do my best. Thanks for having me.
Robert Wood is a tax lawyer. He has a nationwide practice. He is the author of more than 30 books, including Taxation of Damage Awards and Settlement Payments. He can be reached with other content and articles and publications at woodporter.com. He is also host of the Tax Law Channel here on the Legal Broadcast Network. I'm Scott Brake. This once again in service of ATG Trust. Thanks for watching.
Let me just turn this off.
I'm going to